Hello and welcome. I hope you're sitting. This is going to be a long video on the Apex Engineered rear suspension kit installation. So once you got everything unwrapped and unboxed, you're going to lay it out in front of you. Now this color is our hammered gray. It's durable and easy to clean, kind of best of both worlds between gloss and wrinkle. Now you'll have a subframe, a pair of these rear control arms, a pair of the rear uprights, these knuckle tubes or spindle tubes as we call them. This is what your coilover is going to attach to, and you'll have a pair of these rack clamps. Note that these are generally going to be the same color of your subframe, but these are different. You're going to have a pair of axle shafts as well in the kit that's going to be provided. So we got the rear subframe in front of us. The first thing that you'll notice is we have bushings isolators in the front. We have these 3 holes. We have the front ears for the diff and the rear ears for the diff. We also have the mustache bar bushings that we pressed in for this video. They generally don't come installed. All you gotta do is hammer them in, but it's pretty easy. We also have this removable bar in the front of the subframe, which would read remove after installation, and that just kind of helps keep the front of the subframe spread to the correct distance for when you go to install it on the car. You'll notice the back we have these sway bar mounts. Those are integrated now into the rear subframe, so if you have the Z and you order it for a 240Z rear sway bar, you will be able to uninstall the kit really easily with the sway bar. So you'll notice that our rear control arms provided with the kit are very similar to our bushing factory style replacements. These are still the DOM steel too, but they're rigid fixed on the mounting positions. You still have the toe link design. We added some gussets over the years for rigidity. And you'll still have the sway bar pickup point on the rear control arm. Next, we're going to go to the rear uprights. These have been vastly redesigned over the years as well, not only for durability and strength, but also for compatibility with our brake kits. You'll notice now that these are a 2-piece design that feature this knuckle itself. So notice these 4 holes are for the 370Z and these 4 for the S30 wheel bearings. So you can go between 4 lug and 5 lug. Now you'll notice that these 3 holes on the top are for the 370Z e-brake system. We got caliper holes for both our brake kit as well as the 370Z calipers and rotors to make for an economical braking solution. You'll notice here that we also have a drop knuckle. This is a 1-inch roll center correction compared to the factory. And the next thing you'll notice is this built-in camber adjustment onto the rear knuckle. With the redesign, we have a set of knuckle tubes where this allows camber adjustment right at the knuckle level as well as the coilover level. So at any ride height, these will be super helpful to get your camber set correctly. Now you'll notice in this video, we already welded the coilovers on top. If you purchase our coilovers and opt for our welding service, we will do this for you as well. We will weld and powder coat the coilovers so it makes for a seamless install. This is how they would come with the kit if you didn't opt for it, but because this customer wanted his coilovers already welded onto the knuckle tubes, we did it for him and then powder coated this into the beautiful hammered gray finish. Now let's talk about these axle shafts. These are 4340 material. They're very beefy and they can put somebody in a world of hurt if you had these handy. So notice these are splined on both ends. The splines are for various different axles and we'll go through those in a second. So in the hardware, you're gonna get 2 of the rod ends, 2 of the associated jam nuts. You'll get 2 of the spindle pins. You'll also get 20 of the 5/8 washers or 5/8 spacers for your caster adjustment. You'll also get 32 of the 1/2-inch washers, as well as 4 of the 1/2-inch by 3.5-inch bolts and 4 of the 1/2-inch by 2.5-inch bolts. You'll also get 8 of the misalignment spacers. You'll get 2 of the 1/2-inch, 2 of the 5/8 nuts. You'll get 8 of the 1/2-inch nuts, 8 of the M12 split washers. You'll also get a pair of the hex turnbuckles and 8 of the M12 socket head bolts. For the tools, you're gonna need some sockets and some ratchets. For the tools, you're gonna need a 15mm socket, a 3/4 socket, and a 15/16 socket, along with a ratchet, an adjustable wrench, and a 10mm Allen key. So first we're going to start assembling the rear control arms on the bench. You're going to take the rod end, the associated jam nut, and the hex turnbuckle, and we're going to assemble those to the rear control arm. First, you're going to take the jam nut and install that onto the rod end. And then you're going to install the turnbuckle onto that. You're going to do that for both sides, and then you're going to install that assembly onto the rear lower control arm. Let's slide these heim joints out and thread those adjusters onto the rod ends. Next, you're going to take the spindle pin bolts and the 5/8 washers and install one of the 5/8 washers through the pin, and then the other side with the washer and the nut. We're not going to put any of the washers in between until we get our caster set at the alignment shop. Next, we're going to take the misalignment spacers and install those onto the rod ends. Next, we're going to install the knuckles. So the knuckle install is going to go fairly simple. First thing you're going to do is going to slide a 1/2" washer through the 2.5" long bolt and slide that through the fixed hole on your camber adjustable knuckles. Then following that, you're going to take the same 1/2" washer onto the same 2.5" bolt and put that through. Here you'll notice how our camber system works. So next thing we're going to do, we're going to install the wheel bearing onto the knuckle. Here we have the 5-lug 370Z wheel bearing. You'll notice the reason we went 370Z is because it's 5/114.3. It has a very large spline and it has the same center bore as a lot of Nissan parts. So for the 370Z, we're going to use these 4 sets of bolts. So we're going to line those bolts up. We're going to take our 12mm split lock washer, put that onto the 12mm Allen head bolt, and we're going to start threading those through. And then using the 12mm Allen key, we're going to go ahead and tighten those down. Then the 1/2" washer and the 1/2" nuts. So with that assembly finished, let's move on to the axles. So this axle assembly can be pretty complicated, so we're going to try to explain it the best we can. So here we have a 370Z axle. For this customer, he opted for a 370Z differential as well as a 370Z wheel bearing. So he purchased a 370Z axle on both sides. If a customer was to want a Ford 8.8 differential as well as a 370Z wheel bearing, he would have to purchase 2 sets of axles. He would have to purchase a 370Z axle and a Ford Explorer axle, because this side would be the 8.8 and this side would be the 370Z. And we would have this axle splined on both ends, one side 8.8 and the other side 370Z. But for this customer, he did 370Z both sides, so that's why we are only giving him the 370Z to 370Z axles, and he only has to purchase 1 pair of axles. So prior to installing the subframe, there's a few things you'll notice. Here we don't have a spare tire installed. However, if you have a 240Z, the spare tire has to be modified. If you have a 260 or 280Z, the chances of it is very low, as those spare tires are moved further back. Now here you're also going to have to notch this area out. It's about 6 to 7 inches long. It's about 1 inch by 1 inch. And what we'd highly recommend is taking a piece of angle iron and re-welding it in there. In this video, we're just going to cut this section out because he's going to be installing the track attack kit later. Now here we're going to prep the subframe. We're going to have the bushings already pressed in, and we have the front ears and the rear ears lined up, ready to go for this 370Z differential. So the few pieces of hardware that we don't provide with the kit is going to be the mounting bolts and nuts for the front of the diff and the rear of the diff. Oftentimes those comes with the diff, as you're going to be sourcing them anyway. So that's why we usually don't provide those. So for this install, we sourced our bolt and a washer to use for the front ears. We highly recommend using an oversized washer like so then the differential bushings don't happen to pull out under high horsepower. So we don't have the axles assembled, that's going to be following, but here you can see that we have the axle lined up, and as we would clear, this would be how it rotates amongst into the subframe. And the same thing would be on the other side. You also notice that we did update the subframes so then they have better axle clearances for the 370Z differentials. Next, we installed this on the car. Pretty much you would install the rear. We did not film us installing that because this is really heavy, and I had to use the aid of our cameraman because that was a lot of weight. But we had this installed onto the car. We're pretty much going to torque these to the factory spec. Now you'll notice that in the front we also had these installed, but we have the bar still running. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and remove the bolts and remove the bar. The bar is just there to help us line it up. We can go ahead and reapply the bolts, washers, and lock washers after that front bar is removed. So here we're gonna add a ratchet extension and going to go ahead and tighten these front clamps down onto the subframe. So now we're going to install the rear control arms. We're going to take the 1/2 inch washer through the 1/2 inch bolt. I'm going to slide that through. We're going to go with the middle setting because that's going to be kind of where the factory spec is going to be. As you lower or raise your car, you're going to use the bottom or top hole. But for right now, we're going to go ahead and use the middle hole. We're going to slide a 1/2 inch washer on both of those bolts. And then we're going to go ahead and install the rear control arm onto the rear subframe. And then after those are installed, we're gonna fill the gap with another set of washers. Now the reason why we have washers in between the control arm is so if you have the front part is up and on the top hole and the back mount is on the bottom hole, for that misalignment, those washers would take up the gap. You'll finish this by putting another 1/2 inch washer and a nut onto the other side of the control arms, and then you'll go ahead and tighten that down. Now because this customer is going for the track attack kit, we're not going to tighten any of those bolts down. We're just going to go ahead and dry fit this for the sake of the install video. So here you see us installing the coilover and rear knuckle. You're going to mount the control arm. You're going to slide the spindle pin through the rear knuckle. So here we're going to mate the control arm to the rear knuckle. We have a stack of these caster washers. They go on either side depending on how your caster wants to be set up. So here we got 4 in the back. We're going to slide the spindle pin through the knuckle. Then you're going to take the 5/8 washer and 5/8 nut and go ahead and put those onto the spindle pin. So that wraps up about this video. The axle is going to be installed in the track attack video. Because this customer is going for the full track attack kit, we're not going to go ahead and install the axle on this one. However, here we're doing a quick glimpse on the adjustable camber. Now the knuckle is not torqued, so that's why this camber is adjustable. Once it's torqued down, you will not be able to adjust it. You still got the e-brake holes here, and you'll notice the caliper is going to be towards the front of the car because that's how the factory caliper location would be. So once you have the CV axle installed, you're going to go ahead and torque the nut to about 180 foot-pounds, but I would recommend referring to the Nissan manual. You're going to go ahead and torque the back socket head bolts to 80 foot-pounds. Then you're going to also go ahead and torque the nuts and bolts holding the camber adjuster on the knuckle to 80 foot-pounds. We'll change that. You're going to go ahead and torque the spindle bolt to 82 foot-pounds. And you're going to go ahead and torque the nuts and bolts holding the rear control arm to the subframe to 55 foot-pounds, along with the toe adjuster link to 55 foot-pounds, as well as the Allen head on the back holding the rear Apex engineered brace to 55 foot-pounds. So part of giving the customer as much information as possible before any purchase, we took off the control arms and uprights to get a better view and clarity on how the differential, this is a 240Z differential, bolts to the subframe. So as you'll see later in the video, there are some chassis modifications required for this fit, but we'll go over them right now, just so then you understand every single thing that may be required. The first thing is going to be the chassis notch for the 240Z differential, being a taller differential. We do our best to reduce the amount of modification required. Going with a tubular design on the subframe is great for strength and weight reduction. However, one thing to always consider is going to be the size of tubing. Sometimes does impede having a completely bolt-on solution. So here we're going to go through any modifications required ahead of purchasing, so that way you know and the customer has a clear understanding of what would be required. The first thing is going to be the chassis notch for the 240Z differential. That being such a tall differential, there is a notch required, as you'll see later in the video. You'll notice with the updated V2 design, the front subframe ears are raised up, so you do not need any large spacers in the front of the ears. There is this little bracket here on a 240Z that does protrude, and you can see here I can fit a finger between the top of the ear and the actual back cabin boxes. And there's a little bracket there. It just has to be bent so it clears out of the way. The only other thing that we can see here on a 240Z or a 260Z is going to be some of the brake line brackets up top may be more difficult to route brake lines through because the 370Z is such a large diff compared to the factory R180s or the R200. So we would recommend rerouting some brake lines ahead of time or as you're doing the process, so you don't end up having brake lines that are really difficult to get into once you have everything installed. The other item that you'll notice here is going to be this back tube. The back tube is bent, if you can see, and that is to clear away from this back storage department. It's easier to modify the spare tire well than it is to modify this storage compartment, but in doing so, the spare tire well would have to be modified. If you have a S30, it's not a lot. On 240Zs, it tends to be more than those of a 260 or 280Zs. The spare tire on the 260, 280Zs is pushed back a little more, but on a 240Z, either removing the spare tire well or a heavy notch into the spare tire well would be required. One thing to note is you can still fit the spare tire in there, depending on the wheel size, obviously, but that is something to note is the spare tire well would have to get modified. One thing that I would consider a benefit is these rear ears on the subframe. Now, you may have a 260 or 280Z where the sway bar was bolted to the chassis, but you can, even though if you have a 260, 280Z, you can run a 240Z rear sway bar, and that way when you unbolt the 6 bolts that connect the subframe, you can drop the entire sway bar with it rather than having to undo the sway bar and then undoing the 6 bolts to drop the whole rear end. So we hope we did a pretty good video explaining the installation of the rear suspension kit. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, give us a call, drop us an email, and always like and subscribe.